Good afternoon and welcome to 22 News in Focus. I'm Ciara Speller. November elections are just 2 months away and there's no state or federal races, but most local municipalities have elections, from mayor to city and town council to school committee. Today on 22 News in Focus, we'll be looking at the local mayoral races, the political climate both locally and nationally, and what you need to know before you vote. Before you can participate in the election process, you have to be registered to vote. So joining me now is Brenna Murphy-McGee, City Clerk and Registrar of Voters for the City of Holyoke. Thank you for being here with us today, Brenna.
Thank you for having me.
My first question for you is, how do you register to vote, and do you have to pick a party affiliation?
So there's 3 different ways that residents can register to vote. One is they can come into their local election official office. They can do it through any transaction at the RMV. They can also send in a mail form, which they can download on the Secretary of State's website. And they can also do it online through the Secretary of State's website as well. And they do not have to pick a party. They can choose to register unenrolled if they choose.
And so what is the benefit of registering independent or unregistered?
So unenrolled means you don't have to vote within the party, a particular party. For example, if the presidential primary has a Republican ballot and a Democratic ballot, you can choose to vote either ballot. Whereas if you're registered in a particular party, you have to only vote that particular ballot.
Okay. And who's eligible to vote?
Any United States citizen that's over the age of 18 or over can register. We can also now pre-register 16 and 17-year-olds.
Okay. And when would a voter require an ID?
If they're voting in their first federal election, they can be asked to see an ID, and also if they're an active voter. Also, if a poll worker suspects that somebody is saying that they are somebody that they believe they're not, they can ask for an ID as well.
Okay. And voter fraud is a growing concern. Recently, there were reports of people voting in more than one state and people voting for deceased persons as well. So how can this be detected and prevented?
So one of the things we do in my office, especially with elections coming closer, is I have a staff member that will weekly present a list to another staff member that works the voter roll and gives her the list of all of the deceased people from Holyoke that we have come through, and we remove them from the voter roll. And we do that especially with elections coming up, we do it on a more frequent basis.
Right. And sometimes cities and towns clear their voting rolls. Why do they do this, and how does someone become unregistered?
So in Massachusetts, every city and town is required to do an annual census, and if you do not return your census back to our office, you will become an inactive voter. And at that point, we will then send out a confirmation card to your address with just requiring you to sign it, saying that you still do live at the address that you're registered to vote at. And if that card comes back saying that you're no longer there, we can remove you. Or if it comes back, we just don't see it at all, you will remain on the inactive list until you do the census the following year or vote in an upcoming election.
Okay, important to know. And if you're registered in one town but moved to another, do you have to re-register to vote in that town?
You definitely do. And you should do it 20 days before that town or city's election, because there is a cutoff to register in a city or town, and it's always 20 days prior to the election.
And so what would that process be for someone?
The same process as it is for a new registered voter. You can do it through the mail, you can do it online, you can do it at the RMV, you can do it in office as well.
And how about if you move within the same town, do you have to notify your change of address?
Yes, you should also come in or call the office for that. You can also do that online through the Secretary of State's office. And any changes that are made through your voter registration through the Secretary of State's offices are always forwarded to the appropriate city or town, so we can make those changes in our system as well.
Okay, how can someone verify that they're registered to vote? Maybe they're not sure, or, they'd like the clarification.
So the Secretary of State's office has a really big, tons of information for anybody that's looking for anything for elections. So there is a tab on the Secretary of State's office, am I registered to vote? And you can just simply put in your address and your name in there, and it will come up and give you everybody that, what district you live in, what ward you should be, where you should be voting, who will be on your ballot. Everything's on there. And you can also just call the office and, give us your name and address, and we can verify for you if you're registered or not.
Okay. And can the town clerk or election commission office provide proof of registration?
Yes, we can. We can give you a certificate of voter registration.
Okay. How does someone find out where their polling place is?
Once again, it's the same on the Secretary of State's office. You can put in your address, where do I vote MA, and you can just put in your address and it will direct you into the right polling place. You can also call the office, you can come into the office, any of those, we can help you out.
And what are the hours for the office if they decide to come in?
Our office is 8:30 to 4:30, Monday through Friday.
Okay. And explain the voting options, early and absentee, and who's eligible.
So early voting, anybody is eligible for if you're a registered voter. However, we do not have early voting for municipal elections right now. Someday, in the future, the state may change that law, but right now it's only for state elections. So next year, in March 2020 for the presidential election, we will have a early voting designated days. But right now, absentee voters, anybody that's going to be out of town on election day can absentee vote if you have a religious belief that prevents you from going to the polls on election day, or if you're disabled, you can vote absentee.
And so how about the postmark? What would need to be the date on the envelope?
It has to be postmarked the day. It has to be postmarked by noon the day before the election.
Okay.
But we can accept them in the mail the day of the election, and they'll be brought to the appropriate polling place.
Okay. And several Western Massachusetts communities will have preliminary elections.
Correct.
What's the difference between a preliminary and a primary? So
a primary election narrows the fields of candidates down in a particular party, or for a particular party to nominate a candidate. Whereas a preliminary election, such as in Holyoke, we do preliminary elections for nonpartisan races. Our city council, our mayor, our treasurer, our city clerk are all nonpartisan offices, so our elections are preliminary elections, narrowing just the field of candidates down before the general election.
Because this year's elections are local, is there concern about voter turnout?
In Holyoke, I know the preliminary election is only one ward race, so we are expecting a pretty low turnout for that. And overall, I just feel like we see a lot less of a turnout in local races as we do in state races, and I think that's just because some people, feel they're not electing a president or a state official, that it's not as important to vote, where it really is, because the local leaders are the ones that are making our daily decisions on our behalf. So it really is important for folks to go out and vote for local leaders.
And again, we touched on this earlier, but if someone has questions about voting in their town or city, who should they contact?
They can call our office, they can call the Secretary of State's office, and we have active party committees as well, and I'm sure a lot of cities and towns do as well, and those folks are really great about answering questions for elections as well.
And just for those who are just joining us now, can we talk about, voting age and requirements again?
Sure. So you have to be 18 to vote, but you can be 16 and 17 to pre-register. You can do it online, you can do it in the mail, you can download the form on the Secretary of State's office, and you can do it at any transaction at the Registry of Motor Vehicles as well as in office.
Yeah, and so 18, maybe you're in high school still, maybe you're just starting your freshman year of college.
Right.
So talk about the process, if they're away from home, they can't get there, what is that option for them again?
So if someone is living away from home, a college student, they can vote absentee. They just simply need to mail in or email in the absentee ballot application, and we'll mail them a ballot directly to them at college. We'll receive it back in, and it will be sent to the correct polling location that they're registered to vote in our city.
And do you know if there are any colleges locally who have an option for voting?
I don't think so.
So it would just be the absentee ballot would be the best way?
Right, the best way, yeah.
And
unless they're registered to vote in that city or town that their college is in, with a permanent residence. But otherwise, if they're registered in their hometown and living out of their hometown, then they need to do absentee or come home on election day.
Right. And so how much in advance should they be seeking the absentee ballot and things like that?
So absentee ballots for this preliminary election, September 24th, are available in our office now, and the ones for the general election will probably be ready within a couple weeks after that for the November election. So usually if you just call, we can let you know if they're in, but we do try to have them in, within a couple months of an election.
All right. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Holyoke City Clerk providing us with this important information for our voters, and when we return, we'll take a look at some of the mayoral races in the region. You're watching 22 News in Focus. Today we're talking about this November's elections. Joining me now to discuss some of the local races is Paul Robbins, president of Paul Robbins Associates, a strategic communications company. This year's elections are all local with the exception of statewide ballot questions, which have yet to be determined. 7 Western Massachusetts communities have mayoral races, so let's start with Chicopee. Mayor Koss is not running for re-election. Who are the candidates running for mayor in Chicopee?
Well, there's John View and Joseph Morissette, and there's 2 other candidates also, including Mike Bissonette, who's the former mayor. So as you know, because it's a preliminary, the top 2 vote getters would then go to the final. So I would expect it would be View and Morissette. One of the questions that might be interesting to see, post-election, post-preliminary, is where Mike Bissonette shows in that. So I feel like the issues in Chicopee, Chicopee's been very well run for a long time. The current mayor is very popular. They have leader Wagner, who's in the leadership at the State House. So you don't hear a lot about Chicopee in terms of having issues. So this race will probably be more of a beauty contest or popularity contest. So I expect those 2 to come out of it. The question for the political insiders is how well does Mike Bissonette do as a former mayor, who was beaten by the current mayor, Mayor Koss.
And so Chicopee is one of the largest cities in the region. What are some of the issues that the mayoral candidates will be addressing?
I think you can always get into economic development. The economic development there is real, but it's quiet and compared to Springfield, which has MGM and the Chinese rail car. But again, I think there aren't a lot of defining issues. Again, because it's been well managed, it has great representation in the legislature. But I think one of those things, redevelopment of some old structures like the Uniroyal plant, those things might be at the top. Education, if you do polling in any municipality, you're always going to find education near the top. The economy used to be at the top, but because things are so good, unemployment is low, I wouldn't think that the local economy would be an issue. I think economic development, schools, education would probably top the list.
All right, and moving now to East Hampton's mayor, Nicole LaChapelle. She's running again after winning in 2017. Is there anyone running against her?
She has a couple of counselors running against her, but she's just finished her first term. It's really unlikely after you've done a first term to have a real threat. So I would expect her to come out of that and win the next election, win the preliminary and win the final as well.
Okay, and East Hampton has been called Little Northampton. The city seems to be in an economic development boom. So what are some of the issues that East Hampton candidates will be considering?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things you could look at is it is in a bit of a mini boom, the bleed over from Northampton, which is kind of interesting. So I think they have the same issues that a lot of communities have around education and those types of things. But not that it would be a big issue right now, but what kind of growth do we want to have? If we're starting to become a mini Northampton, do we want to be that? What does that look like? What type of commercial development is going to be done? So that could be an issue, but honestly, I think it's pretty smooth sailing for the incumbent.
All right, and now to Westfield. Westfield has a mayoral election, and the current mayor is not running. State Senator Don Humison has thrown in his hat into the ring to be a candidate for the position. So why would Senator Humison give up being a state legislator, that is, and one of the few Republicans on Beacon Hill to now leave?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it might be more about lifestyle for him. Going back between Westfield and Boston, that is about as long a drive as you can do in Massachusetts to serve your constituents. I think he probably thinks he can do a good job as mayor. But it's a really interesting race in that when you have an open seat, typically voters think, all right, well, there's a chance to maybe the turnout is a little bit larger because people see that open seat. So you have him and you have Mike McCabe, who's a captain in the police department. There's some other candidates. I would expect those 2 to come out of it. But you're asking the question I think a lot of voters might ask. And one of the things that could hurt Don, the senator, is that he's still going to be a senator after this election. Whether if he loses, he still goes back to the legislature. It has happened in campaigns where people like the legislators so much they want to keep him there. So that's going to be a challenge for him. But these are 2 newcomers. You never know how it's going to shake out. The other candidate had applied to be the police chief, was not successful. You could also make the argument there, you wanted to be the chief of police, and now you're running for mayor. So it might be a neutral on those things, but it's always difficult to move from the legislature to a county or local office. It is, but he's well liked, so it'll be really interesting to see the result in Westfield.
Yeah, and so what are some things you think will stand out when people see those two names?
I think it'll end up being more like a popularity contest. So I think the senator's popular. I think if you've worked in the police department all your life, you probably have, for your career, you're probably popular there too. So sometimes it comes down to who gets their vote out. Municipal elections, and particularly preliminaries, have a very low turnout. So federal elections have something between 50 and 60%. State elections have around 40% turnout. It's about 20 or 30% on the local level. And in a preliminary, it can get down as low as 10%. So it might come down to who does the best job of getting their supporters out to the polls.
Right, and now the city of Westfield has had some problems with their water, and that issue concerns, all Westfield residents. What can the candidates do to convince voters the cleanup of the water will be a priority?
So I know, so they discovered some contaminants in the wells at Barnes Air National Guard. The question is whether that leached into the aquifer that, serves most of the water needs in Westfield. The fact, I guess I would be more worried if I was the current mayor, though again, it's something that would seem to be out of someone's hands. They've bonded for a filtration facility. I believe they're suing the federal government about it because it's a federal issue. So while it's an issue and certainly people are going to be concerned about it, I don't think either of the candidates have to take ownership of it. It is interesting. It will be interesting to see how they're going to, how aggressively they're going to pursue making sure that those things are mitigated.
And also in Hampden County, we have Springfield's Mayor Dominic Sarno is running again. He was first elected in 2007 and won 3 more elections since. So who else is running for mayor in Springfield?
You have a couple of folks that, you have Jeff Donnelly and Yolanda Cancel. And they're people from the community, very low name recognition. So because there's 3, you still have to have the preliminary to get to the point where there's 2 left, and obviously Dominic Sarno will be at the top of the ticket. He's a very popular mayor. Springfield is on a roll in terms of economic development. I think the economy is doing extremely well. Unemployment is low. So I think, he's not going to have a problem, and I think it's more of a victory lap he's going to take in the preliminary.
And Springfield City Council has several at-large seats open this year. Which incumbents are running, and who are the new candidates? Do you have any?
So all but 5 of the incumbents. The incumbents are Hurst, Walsh, Letterman. Tim Ryan is an at-large city councilor now, but he's running for his ward seat. So essentially, there's going to be one opening, and so we have a number of people running for it. This again is one of those things where if you have a low turnout, it depends on who has the highest name recognition, and of the folks running, like Moriarty Finn and Poner and some other folks that are out there. It really comes down to want signs, phone calls, mailings, and get the vote out, which is hard to do.
And lastly, what are some of the priority issues city residents, want to see?
I think schools are always going to be at the top of the list. Springfield has underperformed. It's making a lot of progress, but their reading proficiency, for instance, at the end of 3rd grade is about 40%, which means 60% aren't reading proficiently. I think that's always going to be an issue. I think crime is always an issue. It's just one of those things. But in terms of the economy, I think people are happy with the direction of the city. I think, again, those other 2 issues are just, they're common in all urban areas in Massachusetts and throughout New England.
All right, thank you, Paul. When we return, we'll discuss possible ballot questions that voters may be facing in 2020. You're watching 22 News in Focus. Today we're talking about what you need to know to prepare for November's elections. There are no ballot questions for this year, and so far none have been certified for 2020. But there are several potential measures that may be approved for voters to decide in 2020. First, how does a ballot measure get certified?
Sure. People always want to know that. Like, how did this happen, right? So the first thing is a group comes together. It can be a group of citizens or volunteers. It can be an industry advocate wanting to change something. You have to put the petition forward. You bring it to the Attorney General of the state of Massachusetts, and they have to certify that it's constitutional. They're in the process of doing that as we speak. This coming week, they will certify whether these pending ballot initiatives that are underway, that people will be collecting signatures for, that they're constitutional. Once you do that, you have till the end of November to get 85,000 certified signatures. And that means if you and I are voters, we sign the petition, we're a valid signature. If for some reason I've let my voting lapse and I sign it, it's not a valid signature. So to get 85,000 signatures, you essentially have to get about 125,000 signatures, figuring that you do ask people when you're seeing them, are you a voter? Most people will say, even those who might have lapsed. So it's a pretty high bar to clear. That all has to be done between now and the end of November. So your viewers out there who will be going to grocery stores in the next 6 weeks are likely to see folks with clipboards asking them to sign petitions.
All right, Paul, so let's talk about a few of these proposals that might trigger some debate. So first we have the Massachusetts Firearms Storage Initiative. Massachusetts already has some of the strongest gun laws in the country, but what are the chances of this making the ballot?
From what I understand, there's no group behind it except for a group of volunteers. And I think this has really been stimulated by all the mass shootings that have happened in the country. I think people are appalled by that. I think there are some people that want to just do something about it. So by putting an even stricter piece of legislation through a ballot initiative on the ballot, I think there's a sense that we're doing something. And it would require people to, when they have their weapon or gun, to be locked at home, so that if it was not locked and someone used it for a terrible purpose, that person would be liable. Right now, there's no formal group behind either way. The NRA hasn't even emerged to oppose it. My sense is this will be a high bar to clear, even though it might be a good idea, and it might be good for people to weigh in it. I don't think it's going to end up making the ballot.
Okay, and then we have the Right to Repair Initiative. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, so most people will say, didn't we pass that already? So we did a few years ago on a statewide initiative. However, the software in any car nowadays is so sophisticated in technology. If you go in to fix it now, there's more barriers for the mom pop down at the end of the street who you might have gotten your car fixed for forever, is not easily having access to that technology to fix the car. So the idea is this is an update of an old bill initiative that we had previously passed in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, maybe 4 or 8 years ago. I have a feeling this will make it again because the mom pop operations are getting together and say, hey, this is not fair. Could we possibly get it out there again? It passed before. I think it'll get on the ballot. It's likely to pass again.
And so, this one might be confusing for people. So what would it mean if it passed?
If it passes, it means the mom pop that I'm talking about has the ability to fix your car and have all access to the technology. Obviously, the dealers and the manufacturers would prefer probably that you go to the dealer to get your car fixed. And so they'll probably spend money on it. But it comes down to a fairness issue. The fact that it passed before, I think, is probably likely that it would pass again.
Okay, now we have the Massachusetts Beer and Wine in Food Stores Initiative. So other surrounding states have long offered food stores to sell beer and wine. Would businesses require a special alcohol license?
So right now, you might have some food stores that have liquor in them. That's usually done through a local liquor license that they have acquired. By this initiative, that means statewide there would be essentially more liquor licenses available. So for instance, where is food sold? Well, a 7-Eleven, CVS, a Walgreens, a Cumberland Farms, they have food there, there's no alcohol there. So you could see some industry money getting behind that because it's another product that you could sell. It certainly would probably hurt the package stores, so they probably have an association that's working against it. So it would be allowing more access to alcohol in places where food is sold now.
Let's have you weigh in on some of the pros and cons.
Well, I think the pro is people want access to what they want to buy, right? I guess one of the things that you could be analogous in the future is we've just introduced the marijuana business, the cannabis business in Massachusetts, and you have to go to a specific place in order to get it, because in a sense, it's a drug that can be used recreationally. You could make the same case that package stores that sell liquor only should be in a location. So keeping it confined so it's not everywhere in society, I guess, could be a point that people might agree with. On the other hand, we live in a world where people want choice. They want access to the things that they want. And since you do have some food stores, for instance, a Big Y has a wine and beer aisle. So it comes down to what the consumer thinks that they want in their life, and the convenience.
Right. And so the Prevent Sanctuary Cities initiative may appear on the ballot in Massachusetts. What is in this measure?
It's really to do exactly what it says, to prevent communities and cities in Massachusetts to become sanctuary cities. And a sanctuary city is essentially the local community and the local laws not cooperating with the federal ICE and immigration authorities and to protect people. This is largely, I think, a Republican initiative. It probably comes out of this larger debate that's happening in the country with the Trump administration and Congress. I have a feeling that this will probably make the ballot because of the people behind it. I have a feeling also that Massachusetts, because of our progressive liberal tendencies, would probably defeat a measure like this, but I think it'll make it to the ballot.
Right, and so there are two proposals that involve elections. There's ranked choice voting initiative and the top two primary elections initiative.
Kind of the same. So the way the ranked voting is, so to take people back in time, George Bush and Al Gore, very close race. Ralph Nader finished third, had about 5% of the vote. So if I was voting for Al Gore, I liked him, but I liked Ralph Nader more, and I wanted to make a statement about the Green Party or a different party. I might have Ralph Nader number one, and I might make Al Gore number two. At the end of the election, Al Gore is ahead of Ralph Nader, so all the votes that went to Ralph Nader would go to Al Gore and would potentially change the outcome. One of the reasons that they're doing it in a lot of states is because if you have a preliminary, sometimes you have to have 50%, more than 50% to be the winner, and if you're not, then you have to go to another election against number two. If you had ranked voting, and everybody said, I want 1, 2, or 3, and then the folks that lose, their votes go to the person that had the most votes, you end up with a winner. And so it's complicated, but again, it goes back to choice. I know they do it in Maine and some other localities. So it would be interesting to see what happens, but in a practical sense, that's how it would have worked in the presidential election. Not that this is being proposed for the presidential election, but on statewide ballots, local elections, it could serve some use and probably save some money to having fewer elections to do the same thing over again.
Right, so the viewers who are watching now, they've just heard, all the breakdowns, all the explanations, but if they're maybe, still a little confused on this, what's the best way for them to be able to
really to go to the Secretary of State's office, because if you go there now, and I don't have the link, but I can get it to you and you guys can put it on the website, you can see all of the ballot initiatives, and there's more out there. It says essentially that you can see the signatures of the people who are behind it. In some cases they have a brief description, in some cases they don't. Some cases, it's very descriptive in the title, like the anti-sanctuary city one is very, very obvious. So I'd have them go online to the Secretary of State's office.
All right, thank you, Paul. The 2020 federal election is already on people's political radar. We'll learn more about what to expect next year when we return. You're watching 22 News in Focus. We've been talking about the election in November. We've also talked about the possible ballot initiatives that Massachusetts voters will decide in 2020. Let's turn now to the 2020 presidential, Senate, and congressional races that are already making news. Paul, let's discuss the presidential election. Several Republicans have come forward to challenge President Trump, including former Massachusetts Governor William Weld. So what are their chances to win the nomination over a sitting president?
Well, probably two, slim and none. It's really hard to challenge a sitting president. Ted Kennedy did it against Jimmy Carter and kind of famously lost after he had some really good early polling numbers. So the other thing you have to look at is, if you look at polling just within the Republican Party, between 70 and 90% of the Republicans like what Trump is doing. So that's a pretty steep hill to climb. At this point, I think it represents a kind of a protest vote to participate in some primaries. I suppose lightning could strike, right? And so something happens with Trump. Let's say he gets impeached, which I don't think is going to happen, or he resigns. Then whoever's on the ballot is going to end up being in a leadership position. The Republican Party would probably change that, but yeah, really slim chance that that's going to change anything.
And now, what are Republicans looking for from President Trump?
Well, I think the thing that's really fueling him is the fact that they're changing the face of the federal court system, both the district courts, because that's really where the power is with the president and the Senate at this point. The Supreme Court, really big issues that are coming up. Health care, abortion potentially, a lot of heavy issues. So I think the Republicans are happy that that's happening. I think also the tax cut, even though it's leading to $1 trillion deficit, and that bill is going to have to be paid at some point. It's definitely a pro-business, which the Republican Party tends to be. But I will say that there really are two Republican parties, just like, and we can get into it later, two Democratic parties. There's that kind of traditional Republicans, the George Bush Republicans, and then there's the Trump Republicans. And I think he's really dominated the party right now. That may or may not continue. If he loses, I think they'll have an agonizing reappraisal of things. So I think that's where where we are right now.
And the Senate still holds a Republican majority. Do you think, that's here to stay in the next election?
I think there's a chance for the Democrats. The irony is that the last cycle, there were fewer seats up. The Democrats only really needed to flip 4, but they were really tough seats to overcome. I think it's about 3 times that amount now. It's about a dozen seats up. It might be off by a few. But they tend to lean in places like Colorado, even Texas, Georgia, places where Iowa, the Democrats might have a chance. So I think there's a chance. And I think if Trump does poorly on the ballot, there's that down ballot drag that sometimes happens. So look, the Democrats picked up over 40 seats in the House last year. I don't think things have gotten better in terms of how people are viewing the president right now in some of these key battleground states. It's very possible that the Democrats could break through because of the issues of things like the Supreme Court and vital things that are going to be happening in the Senate.
What are you thinking in terms of the House of Representatives?
I think that 40 seats is a lot. That's a bit of a sea change. To reverse that, I think, would be difficult. I think the Democrats maintain the House. I think it's a coin flip. They could have the Senate, and I think the presidency, as of today, I think he's in deep water. The president, that could always change next year, but it feels like it's tilting towards blue in the next cycle.
And the Democrats have a large number of potential candidates. Several have already dropped out, but who do you think are the strongest contenders to be nominated for president at the Democratic convention next July?
Yeah, it's a little weird that we're a year ahead of time and already that's being compressed. I'm one of those that thinks maybe it should keep going for a while. I think at the end of the day, you're going to have Biden, Warren, Sanders, probably Harris, and Buttigieg. It'd be the 5 standing. I always feel like the amount of money that someone raises is kind of like an early primary, and those 5 are raising quite a bit of money. I think a lot of the Obama folks are behind Harris. I think Buttigieg surprised a lot of people. He's very articulate. I think Biden kind of takes the mantle of the Hillary Clinton wing of the party, high name recognition, very popular in the African American community. Bernie made his statement, 4 years ago. I think that's still lurching the party maybe a little bit to the left. And I think Warren is kind of in that Bernie, zone, very similar passion on this similar issues. So currently they're kind of splitting each other up, but I think it comes down to those 5, most likely.
And what are the issues that Democrats will be focusing on in 2020 in order to get the nomination?
Well, if you're asking me, if I was in charge, I would look at the current administration. I would look at the things that he promised to do if I was the consultant. First thing is we're going to have health care that's going to be beautiful. You're all going to love it. And you're going to be able to have pre-existing conditions covered. That did not happen. He was going to work on the deficit. We're going to get that deficit down the first term. We're going to get it down to nothing in my second term. We're heading towards $1 trillion in debt. Infrastructure. We're going to have an infrastructure, candidate Donald Trump said. It's going to be beautiful. This is what I do. I build things. And he got upset because Nancy Pelosi was dismissive of him, and he said, we're not going to have infrastructure. So the best way to win is always to look at somebody's record under a microscope and stay away from some of these fringe issues, which they seem to be doing right now, is staying on the fringe issues and not doing the bread and butter issues that I just outlined, that I think would be the way to unseat him.
Now, how about a vice president? You think that that person will be chosen from among that group?
It's a good question. It depends on who. So if it's Biden, I think he said recently this past week, that that would be something he would look at, someone who would run. He'd also said he'd look at somebody, a person of color or a female. It's not a bad strategy. Jack Kennedy, who was a political enemy of Lyndon Johnson, put him on his ticket. Ronald Reagan had George Bush as his running mate. Sometimes you take the top two, you put them together. I think it's possible. You could have Biden-Harris, or if you had Warren, you could have Warren and Castro. I think it's possible.
So what do Democrats need to do to bring a viable challenger to President Trump?
Yeah, good question. I think they have to stay the course. I think raising money is going to be one of the things that they have to do. Focusing on these kind of basic issues, infrastructure, healthcare. If you go back and do the dissection of the Democrats winning the House last year, that was based on healthcare. That issue has not been resolved by people. So if you put healthcare in front of people, infrastructure, I do think the tax cuts did not do exactly what the Republicans suggested they would do. They said we'd have 6% growth. We haven't had that. Didn't trickle down to the middle class. People are still working 2 and 3 jobs to make ends meet. I think the economics, helps the Democrats, particularly going into next year.
And lastly, if Elizabeth Warren doesn't win the nominations, she still maintains her seat in the Senate. So do you think she'll still be an influencer in the Senate?
For sure. I think it's given her a national platform. This happens frequently. Someone runs for president, doesn't win, but all of a sudden has a very high profile. Beto O'Rourke ran in Texas, had a lot of national attention. That's why he's running for president. So I think it gives her another platform. And frequently, people who run and lose, they become the next people that run the next time. And sometimes they win. So I think her stature and her voice will be even magnified going forward.
All right, thank you. And we'll continue our conversation with Paul Robbins when we return from a short break. You're watching 22 News in Focus. Today you've been watching 22 News in Focus, and we've been talking about the election in November. We're continuing our conversation with Paul Robbins about the 2020 races, and several Massachusetts representatives and senators will be up for re-election next year. So let's talk about those races, Paul. First, we have Massachusetts Congressman Joseph Kennedy announced on Monday that he is considering a run for the U.S. Senate in next year's election. He'd be challenging Senator Ed Markey. So what do you think his reasoning is for making this move now?
Yeah, so I think this really gets at this generational divide that's within the Democratic Party. We talked a little earlier about there's 2 Republican parties. I think it's also really true in the Democratic Party. There's a new generation coming up, tends to be more liberal. There's the more traditional wing of the party on the opposite side, which is more the Clinton, part of the party. So I think what it really says to me, having done a lot of campaigns in my past, is that Senator Markey is probably weak in terms of polling. And so while I was surprised, like a lot of people were to hear, and my next thought was, well, there must be some weakness there. And usually you can tell if a candidate is vulnerable, if they have opponents. So 2 people that jumped in on the Democratic side in the primary, 2 unknowns but with really good resumes, who might have shocked the world and defeated Markey. We've had that happen in Massachusetts. Presley is Congresswoman from a surprised a long-term incumbent. AOC in New York did the same thing. So I think that bug has gotten into the system, that now's the time. So I think he determined that, what am I going to wait for? And these if he has the ambition to be a United States Senator, that's a 6-year term. So think of waiting another 6 years. That's 3 terms in the Congress on the House side. So what we all understand is that there might have been a poll done and Markey showed some weakness. Kennedy may have already been ahead of him or close to him. And so I think, you know, the future is now, I think, is the way they looked at it. So I think we're likely to see that battle in the primary.
Yeah, and so what do you think his chances are against Markey, who's, you know, very popular?
Yeah, so I question his popularity. You know, he's been a advocate for consumers for a long time, but again, the party's changed. Someone asked and suggested to Kennedy, I think last week, well, why don't you wait your turn? I mean, that's been kind of the buzz out, and even on social media. His response is these issues are too vital right now. They're happening too fast to wait. And again, if you're waiting 6 years to run for Senate, what's the world going to look like in 6 years, right? Who's the president going to be? What's the Congress going to look like? What are the issues, you know, what mitigation will we be doing on global warming and infrastructure and those kinds of things? So I feel like he felt that there's some weakness there, and so I think he's trying to exploit it. He's had a great record in Congress. So I think the opportunity is there, and sometimes you just have to go for it when it's available.
And do you think there are any presidential ambitions there for Kennedy?
You know, if you have the word Kennedy in president, you know, ambition's going to be circled around there someplace. So, you know, the interesting thing about him is he's kind of done it the old-fashioned way, working his way up. You know, Ted Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy really came out of nowhere after their brother was president to run, one for Senate in Massachusetts, one in New York. They zoomed ahead of the field. This Joe Kennedy is kind of taking it the more traditional route, although it kind of contradicts what I just said, is that he would making this leap. So for sure, I think there's some possibility he might have some ambitions down the road.
All right, moving now to Elizabeth Warren. Want to get your thoughts on, should she become president or even vice president or be appointed to a cabinet seat if a Democrat takes the White House?
Yeah, I think what's going to happen with her, I'd be surprised if she took a cabinet seat. I mean, everything's possible. She was a law professor at Harvard. I suppose she could be attorney general. If you want to be the president someday, John Kerry always had this. He always wanted to be president, and he didn't take a position in the cabinet until it was clear he wasn't going to run for president again. I think she's likely going to go back to the Senate. She'll have a high profile. And, you know, if Joe Biden is the nominee and wins, you know, his age is a factor. Maybe Joe Biden announces, I'm just going to be a one-term president. Maybe, you know, you don't know what's going to happen within 4 years. So I think she's going to end up staying in the Senate.
Yeah, and so a possible in for Joe Kennedy if he or someone else doesn't unseat Markey?
Yeah. You know, I think those 2 seats, you know, the Senate seats in Massachusetts are very, very valued. So if Warren moved on, obviously it's an open seat. Another person you have to look at is Catherine Clark, who's a congressman from Eastern Massachusetts. Very popular. She was very popular in the State House. She was a state senator. So there's people we don't even know that might be interested in one of those seats if they opened up.
All right, and Congressman Richard Neal has been challenged by Alex Morse, who's the mayor of Holyoke. Neal's been the district's representative since 1988. He's been challenged in the past, but continues to be popular with, you know, his constituents. Yeah. So how now he now chairs the House and Ways Means Committee, a very powerful position. What are the chances that Morse or anyone else can beat him?
This is probably the classic example of the Democratic Party kind of shaving off into two different parties. Really surprising that popular mayor doing good work in Holyoke would run for a seat against not only an incumbent but one of the more powerful congressmen and hardest working congressmen in Washington. So I think that's a really steep uphill battle. I don't think the district is necessarily liberal. It doesn't have the Northampton Amherst piece that used to be in that district. Alex is being supported by Justice Democrats, which is a national organization to get behind liberal campaigns in these primary fights. But I think people, at the end of the day, I think they recognize the power of being chair of Ways and Means. I think that does settle into this area. So I think it's an uphill fight, and I think Congressman Neal's been very visible He's brought a lot of bacon home, as they used to say, to the region. I think that's a really tough one to overcome.
And what other races in Massachusetts should we be looking at?
I really think the ones that we just talked about, I think the marquee race is going to really be kind of a sea change race, a generational shift. I think that's happening all over the country. I think that's why it's happening here, is that there's an opportunity. And you can believe in all the same things, but if the generational voice doesn't kind of match your own, I think millennials will be more involved. I think they might have taken a pass in the last 2 elections. Everything's fine. They were likely probably Obama supporters. Now everything's changed. So I think there's more action, more activity, and there is this generational shift that I think is really happening in the Democratic Party.
Yeah, and so just talking about that generational shift again, we're seeing Alex Morris, we're seeing younger people, Kennedy now, how do you think that's going to influence voters?
Well, the other thing that's really fascinating is the online activity. So Barack Obama was the first candidate to leverage social media to raise hundreds of millions of dollars. That has changed everything. So you can be an unknown, and then through social media, Buttigieg is a perfect example. Tens of millions of dollars he has raised because of his presence on social media. He's only been in a couple debates. That raises your profile. But if anybody's on Facebook, how many times are we all getting hit and seeing these presidential candidates? That's the new part of the landscape that's very different. It used to be traditional media. Over time, I mean, we're talking about people being winnowed out this week. The primaries aren't until next February. It used to be at least between February, March, and April of the actual election year, from Iowa to New Hampshire to whatever the next one is, that you would winnow the field. We're already doing it now, and social media, Twitter, all that has a lot to do with it.
All right, yeah, social media definitely
Yeah.
plays a huge role in that. As you said, we see it every day, so. And we will have the last word for you after the break. Stay with us. You're watching 22 News in Focus. You've been watching 22 News in Focus. Today we've been talking about the election in November and what you need to know before heading out to the voting booth. That is our program for today, but we want to thank our guests for joining us and thank you at home for watching. If you missed any of it, you can watch it in full on WWLP.com. From all of us here at 22 News, we wish you a great day.